All right, good to see you got the memo on the uniform.
I got the memo.
He's got good style. Good to see everybody this evening. We are tonight going to be in Acts chapter 23. Acts chapter 23. Last week we talked, obviously, about chapter 22. And chapter 22 was a very special chapter. And we went over that, and I just want to kind of remind us of that chapter, because chapter 22 is Paul telling his conversion story on the steps of the barracks, going into the barracks being not a military barracks. It was that, but it was also a prison. And so they were taking him in there to keep him arrested. And he asked to speak to the people before he did that. And so he does. And he tells them about how he had, how he was a Jew and raised in Jerusalem, how that he persecuted the church, and how that he went to Damascus to arrest Christians and take them back to Jerusalem to put them on trial. And on his way there, he saw a light, spoke to Jesus, and was told to go into Damascus. And there he would be told what he needed to do to be saved. And we looked at that. We looked at his conversion story. Do you remember the other two chapters that Paul's conversion are recorded in the book of Acts? 9 and 26. So we'll have it again when we get to 26. So 9 is when Luke records it, and in 22 and in 26 are in Paul's words. So he tells his conversion story in two different lessons. This one we looked at last week. The one in 26, does anybody remember when that is? That is his sermon to Agrippa. And when he speaks to Agrippa, the king of the Hebrew king. All right. At the end of chapter 22, when they have him arrested, they decide that they're going to, quote unquote, examine him by flogging. In other words, you beat him a while and they'll talk. Well, they get ready to do that, and he looks over at the officer doing that, and he says, "Is it legal to do this to somebody that's a Roman citizen?" And he goes to the tribune who's in charge and says, "This man claims to be a Roman citizen." So the tribune comes to him and he says, "Tell me, are you a Roman citizen?" And he says, "Yes." And the tribune says, "Well, I paid a lot of money to be a citizen." And Paul said that I was so from birth. Circumstantially so, I would believe that Paul's father likely is the one that purchased the citizenship, if not maybe grandfather, because Paul's father most considered to be wealthy, because for one thing, Tarsus was a place that was tend to be affluent, where Paul was from. But the bigger thing that gives you the idea that Paul and his family had money was the fact that he was raised at the feet of Gamaliel, that he was an understudy of Gamaliel. And Gamaliel, being an understudy of Gamaliel, would have been one of the most prized positions for any young man to be in. It would be the equivalent of going to an Ivy League college in our society. It's something that showed that his father had means and connection. They didn't give scholarships in those days, so you had to have the financial means to do that. I do realize that poor people can go to Harvard today, but that's because of scholarships and other things. But But in that day and time, you had to have the money in order for you to go and be an understudy of someone like Gamaliel. Gamaliel is one of the most recognized and respected of the Jewish leaders, and he plays a pretty big role early in the church, and in which he tells the others, the Sanhedrin, to not do anything to the apostles, and says that if this is from man, it'll come to nothing. But it's from God, we can't stop it. And we'll find out that we'll be fighting against God. And little did he know that was exactly true, and that we'd been fighting against God. And so they bind Paul up, they arrest him, but they do not lay a hand on him because they cannot do that. The Roman system of law was very different from most other ancient systems. The Roman system of law in the courts is somewhat similar to ours. In fact, a lot of what American law was built upon was Roman law, in which citizens had in which they could not be punished until such time that they had been found guilty. And the only thing that can be done now is you can be held. If it's determined you've done something bad enough that you can't be let out on bond, that they'll hold on to you, or that they are afraid you're going to flee, you'll stay in jail. But as far as being sentenced and as far as being sent off to prison, that can't be done to you until such time that you've been convicted. And that's a lot of the way their system was. Verse 30 of chapter 22 says, "But on the next day, desiring to know the real reason he's being accused by the Jews, he unbound him and commanded the chief priests and all the council to meet. He brought Paul down and set him before them." Now, before, he was going to interrogate him by flogging. He was going to examine him. And now that he finds out he is a Roman citizen, well, then due process has got to kick in. And so he brings him before the chief priests, the council, which would be the Sanhedrin, the Jewish council. Bring him there and set him before them. So now this is a much more orderly and law-abiding assembly. Verse 1, chapter 23. "And looking intently at the council, Paul said, 'Brothers, I have lived my life before God in all good conscience up to this day.'" Now, what do you suppose about that? Paul says, "I've lived in a good conscience up to this day." Okay, so the things he did before he became a Christian, he thought he was doing what was right. But he was able to say to them, "I've done this with a good conscience." Now, Paul says that with the Holy Spirit inspiring and saying it. So is that a lie? No. Okay? So we have to take what he said as being correct, that Paul had done everything he had done in a good conscience. The way we can understand that is what Lois said, that he had done the things he did before he became a Christian in a good conscience. He was sincere about those things, and he was not violating his conscience because he believed that Jesus and his followers were wrong. So, many people will say, it doesn't matter what you do as long as you don't violate your conscience. As long as what's right with you is not violated, then you're okay. Well, that's not true at all, is it? And this certainly shows that. He had done a lot of wrong things, had done a lot of very bad things, but yet they hadn't violated his conscience because his conscience was not right. You see, a conscience can be your greatest guide, or you can be your greatest detriment. Depends on how you train it. His conscience was trained to believe that he and the other Jewish leaders, the the chief priests, the Pharisees, that they had all the right answers. And so because they had all the right answers, then Jesus over here, who had different answers and didn't agree with them, must be wrong because we're right. And that's a real folly. If we or anybody else have come to a mindset that we've got all the answers, and if you do something different than us, you must be wrong. That is a faulty logic all the way around. Now, that's what they did. That's how the Pharisees and that's how the Sadducees could believe what they believed, because they figured, we're right, so anything different than us must be wrong. And that is a very dangerous concept. Now, how can we know we're right? Well, we can know we're right because of the Bible. Okay? And so we can know we're right, and we can know that things that are different from the Bible are therefore wrong. But we can't make the assumption ever that we've got all the answers. Because if we do, then we close our minds off to think, we close our minds off to learn. And we need to make sure that we are continually learning. And you see, that's why some people get trapped. You know, the oldest con in the book is to get somebody to think that they're the ones doing the conning. You know, they're the ones that have the answers. And that's the way to get caught. And so the Pharisees, the Sadducees, thought they had all the answers, and therefore anybody and everybody else was wrong. And the folly of that is very apparent when you go through the New Testament. He says this in verse 2, and the high priest Ananias commanded those who stood by him to strike him on the mouth. Then Paul said to him, God is going to strike you, you whitewashed wall. Are you sitting to judge me according to the law? And yet contrary to the law, you ordered me to be struck. Those that stood by said, would you revile God's high priest? Paul said, I did not know, brothers, that he was the high priest. For it is written, you shall not speak evil of the ruler of the people. Now, Paul was still right in what he said. Okay, he was right. He had no right to strike him because Paul was telling the truth. And, you know, he certainly was saying the truth. And it is quite obvious, and it is true, that he was a whitewashed wall. But that was probably not the thing you should say to the high priest. Paul recognized that there was a better way of dealing with the high priest. Even though the high priest did not live up to what he should be, and he was not a righteous man like he ought to have been, Paul recognized the position of the high priest and honored it, whether the high priest was worthy or respectful or not. And that's something that's lost a lot in our society. And it's, you know, I mean, I don't care who you are, you really need to respect the tenets of our society, our government. Whether you like a president or whether you like a senator or a governor or whatever, you know, you should still have the decency to treat those individuals with respect, whether they're respectable or not. You know, Paul's dealing with a guy that is not really worthy of respect, but he recognizes that God wants his whole high priest to be respected. And
how would Paul know that he was the high priest to begin with? Because the area they were in, the Roman soldiers were allowed in it, so that would not have been the inner sanctuary.
Well, it wasn't the temple they were in.
So, but that's what I'm saying. So he probably was not dressed in his normal.
Yeah, he was not, and Paul didn't know who it was. Now, and in that time frame, they kept changing the high priest. It wasn't a position for life like it was supposed to be. It was supposed to be, once you became the high priest, you were the high priest until you died, like it was in the line of succession before. But they had come to where they swapped the high priest every year or two, and the person that was not there and among them on a regular basis maybe wouldn't know who high priest was. And of course, they were not carrying out the position the way that God had wanted
the fact that he told the people to slap him, that's against the law anyway.
Absolutely.
And,
And when you consider that he was a Roman citizen, if he didn't violate anything else, he violated the law that was in place. And but Paul wasn't trying to bring about that. He was just simply trying to present the truth. And he wasn't so much worried about his rights being exercised as he was about God's will being done. And so, he pointed that out to him, and when he realized it was the high priest, he said, well, he apologized and said he didn't know he was the high priest, and says, it's written not to speak evil of the ruler of the people. And certainly that was important.
That was no compliment when he called him. When you whitewash something.
Oh yeah, that was
you cover something up.
Oh yeah, exactly. That was a pretty strong statement made against him, and it was true because he was, the high priests in that time were, not very good characters. They were much more like the medieval popes that were infamous during the Middle Ages, that could be bought and sold and all those kinds of things that we find about. Yeah, whited sepulchres is what Jesus called them. So yeah, definitely the same kind of thing. And so yeah, they were not what they appeared to be. And so they were saying one thing, doing something different. And Paul is wise enough to recognize that. Paul is a smart individual. And in verse 6, now when Paul perceived that part were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, he cried out in the council. Now I want to say this. Paul knew what he was doing. Paul was very bright. And the best way to win in any argument is to divide. And Paul threw something out there and was able to step back and let things unfold. And that's what he does. Paul recognizes that some in the room are Sadducees and some are Pharisees. And so he says this, brothers, I am a Pharisee, a son of Pharisees. It is with respect to the hope and the resurrection of the dead that I am on trial. It is true. The hope and the resurrection of the dead, talking about Jesus Christ. But it's the hope of the resurrection of the dead. Well, Sadducees do not believe in a resurrection. Pharisees do. Pharisees believed in spirits and believed in angels. Sadducees do not. And so Paul picked a side. Paul did grow up as a Pharisee. And so he could say that. He didn't say I was a Pharisee. He says I am. I think that's intriguing. He hadn't disavowed himself entirely of that. He says I am a Pharisee. And I'm a son of Pharisees. I've been that for generations. And it's because of the resurrection of the dead I'm here today. So what happens is he has lined himself with half the room, or a sizable portion of the room. And so what happens? They take their attention off of him and aim it at each other. And verse 7, when he said this, a dissension arose between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. For the Sadducees say that there is no resurrection, nor angel, nor spirit, but the Pharisees acknowledged them all. Then a great clamor arose, and some of the scribes of the Pharisees' party stood up and contended sharply. We find nothing wrong with this man. What if a spirit or angel has spoken to him? So all of a sudden, he was in this room and had no one on his side. Now he has some ardent supporters that are pleading his case, and all he's got to do is stand off to the side. See, that's smart. That's exactly what he's done. I'll make this statement. I don't want to have any other statements, but in a lot of ways, that's what happens in the political process with the opposing party. Now, the Republicans would be doing it too if it was a Democratic president. But the other party, they fight with each other, and then they get a nominee, and then they go and have the regular election. But that's exactly what happens. They fight like crazy amongst each other, and it becomes a real mess.
But whenever Paul makes this statement, he's making it as a Christian, and it's what we believe in.
Absolutely. He's saying that. He's saying, I'm here because of the resurrection. That's why I'm here. And so what he does is he gets them to fight with each other because they're fighting with each other. He doesn't have to say a word. He can just kind of stand back and just kind of wait. You know, that's the best way to win an argument, is not to say a word. And so he gets them fighting. And they, in verse 10, the dissension became violent, and the tribune, afraid that Paul would be torn to pieces by them, commanded the soldiers go down and take him from them by force and bring him into the barracks. And following night, the Lord stood by him and said, before we get to that, Paul realized that he could play them against each other by saying, hey, I'm a Pharisee, I grew up as a Pharisee, and I've come from a long line of Pharisees, and it's because of the resurrection of the dead that I'm here. And that just caused all kinds of chaos. They were united against Paul. Now they're divided against each other. And they can't come to a conclusion about him because they can't come to a conclusion with each other. Now, the flip side of that dynamic is this. There's some lessons to learn there. Even though we're not Pharisees and we're not Sadducees, we or anybody else cannot do things if we're divided against ourselves. And Paul realized that if they were divided against each other, he was going to get out of there and it was going to be fine. Whatever the issue is, if a wedge can be driven between us to where we're fighting against each other, we will stop doing what it is we're to do. Now, of course, that's learning a positive lesson from a negative event because they're doing what's wrong. I'm not justifying the Pharisees and Sadducees. In fact, just the opposite of that. But we can learn something to say, hey, if we're trying to do something and we're fighting amongst ourselves, we're sunk. And because we are not going to be able to do it, because we must work together. And they fail at their cause because they were divided. Like I said, I don't want to open a political discussion, but a lot doesn't get done in our country because we are divided. We fail to do a lot of things we should do because of that kind of division. And I think everybody would agree with that no matter where you fall politically or what side you're on or anything like that. We don't get very far from being divided. Verse 11, God says to him, the Lord comes to him and says, take courage, for as you have testified to the facts about me in Jerusalem, so you must also in Rome. See, Paul had preached a great sermon in the previous chapter. We looked at that last week. He had testified about the Lord. He had given the gospel in its most powerful form. The sermon that Paul preached in Acts 22 is probably the greatest most powerful sermon in the church other than Peter's sermon on Pentecost. I mean, of the time from the church began, you know, the impact that Paul preached, and when we look at how that is, how his conversion came about, is such a powerful lesson. Well, he had done that, and he's going to give his chance to do that in Rome, and if he would just hold on and continue on. What a great bit of encouragement and faith that Jesus is giving to Paul to say, hang in there. You've done it here, you're going to get to do it in Rome. And so you're going to testify in Rome for me.
Could you imagine what Paul was thinking? That he'd been prophesied not to come here, and now all of a sudden, I'm here and I shouldn't have come. And then, of course, Jesus reassures him.
Right. Jesus reassures him of why he's there and what he's done. You know, what you've done is it's on track. It's on track. And much the way that Jesus got reassurances throughout his ministry as to what he was doing. That, you know, the Spirit comes down like a dove, and God speaks at his baptism and says, this is my Son. And then later on at the Mount of Transfiguration, the bright light and the voice says, this is my Son, in whom I'm well pleased, listen to him. At those points, God interjected, and the Spirit interjected to show Jesus, and to show the disciples that he was with him. He endorsed him and was with him. And we see that throughout about the life of Christ, that God kept interjecting to be there with him. And so even Jesus needed those reassurances. And so it was important for that. Verse 12. When it was day, the Jews made a plot and bound themselves by an oath, neither to eat nor drink until they had killed Paul. Now I'm assuming, we're not told, but I'm assuming it was the Sadducees that did that, because the Pharisees were okay with it. Unless some of them got mad after they thought about what happened. But they decide, we are not going to eat or drink till we kill him. And that's pretty serious, isn't it?
It's the religious thing to do.
The religious thing to do? Yeah, we're going to fast till then. I wonder how many of them died of no food. Because we all know that's not where Paul died. I doubt any of them did. They probably died of something else. But anyway, I digress. We're not going to eat or drink till we kill Paul. There are more than 40 who made this conspiracy. Okay? So you've got over 40 that have said, we are not going to eat or drink until we've killed him. They went to the chief priests and elders and said, we have strictly bound ourselves by an oath to taste no food till we have killed Paul. Now therefore you, along with the council, give notice to the tribune to bring him down to you, as though you were going to determine his case more exactly. And we are ready to kill him before he comes near. So they are getting ready to do a prisoner transfer. You know, I mean, how many times have you seen this script in a movie? They're going to take so-and-so to another jail or whatever, or to the courthouse, and the bad guys come in with their van and, you know, overtake them and overpower the marshals and run off with them. Well, that's what they're going to do. They say, have Paul come down and bring him before the council and have the tribune to bring him down. They'll send 3 or 4 soldiers. He's not a dangerous man. They'll send 3 or 4 soldiers down, and we'll lay in wait on the way. We'll ambush him, kill him. Done deal. Okay? So that's what they're going to do. That's the plan that they have set up. And so they hatch this plan. And verse 16, Now the son of Paul's sister, and we don't know who this is, but the son of Paul's sister heard of their ambush. And so he went and entered the barracks and told Paul. Paul called one of the centurions and said, "Take this young man to the tribune, for he has something to tell him." So he took him and brought him to the tribune and said, "Paul, the prisoner, called me and asked me to bring this young man to you, as he has something to say to you." The tribune took him by the hand, and going aside asked him privately, "What is it that you have to tell me?" And he said, "The Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul down to the council tomorrow, as though they were going to inquire somewhat more closely about him. But do not be persuaded by them, for more than 40 of their men are lying in ambush for him, who have bound themselves by an oath neither to eat nor drink till they have killed him. And now they are ready, waiting for your consent." So the tribune dismissed the young man, charging him, "Tell no one that you have informed me of these things." So there is some high-stakes espionage going on there. There is some spying. The son of Paul's sister somehow or another found out about the plot. And so he makes his way to the barracks and tells Paul. And Paul grabs one of the centurions, like they follow Paul's bidding, but says to the centurion, "Take this young man to the tribune and let him tell him what he needs to say." And so he does. And the tribune hears this and says, "Don't tell anybody about this."
This has to be Providence.
Oh yeah, this is all providence, of course. Certainly it's providence. And so you have this plot that is going on. On one side you've got, you know how like in the movies, you'll see a scene in the movie and this group over here is preparing what they're doing, and then you go over here and you see the other scene. And so you got the one scene, there's 40 plus men and they're all ready to go. They've got their knives sharpened and they're hiding in the ditch and they're ready to go, and their stomach's starting to grumble, but they're determined and they're ready to go. And so they're watching. And then you've got the Pharisees and the Sadducees, the council, and they're waiting to hear what's happened. They're the head guys off waiting. And so you've got this young man sneaks in under the cover of darkness and tells them this is what's going to happen. And the tribune is the one that holds all the power. He's the Roman leader in that area. He's the one in charge. Nobody can do anything without his okay. And so we go on from there. Verse 23. Then he called 2 of the centurions. Now what's a centurion? Okay. It may or may not be a literal 100 men, but generally it was you had about 100 men. Therefore, a centurion, one of 100. Generally, it was the centurions that ran the military, because they had 100 men each or thereabout. I'm sure that it came and went as far as that number goes. But roughly, a centurion would have 100 men, and they were some of the most powerful leaders in Scripture. Interestingly enough, when you look at the different centurions, they end up being a pretty good group of people. Remember, Cornelius was a Roman centurion, first Gentile convert. You remember it was a centurion at the cross that said, "Surely this is the Son of God." There were different centurions. The one who had a servant that was very sick that Jesus healed. And the people said, "You know, he deserves this. He built our synagogue, and he's a good man." So anyway, they were known to be bad. They were known to be the picture of evil of the Romans. But in Scripture, the centurions that are mentioned end up being pretty good guys most of the time. And so it was one of those that went to the tribune. Well, he tells two of the centurions, get ready 200 soldiers with 70 horsemen and 200 spearmen. So how many is that? 470. Roman soldiers were probably the best trained soldiers until you come to modern times. Nobody messed with Roman soldiers. And 470 of them was a pretty imposing force. 200 regular soldiers, 70 on horses, and 200 spears. There is not going to be 40 average Jews that are going to take on this bunch. So he does not mess around. Paul, he could have been a serial killer and wouldn't have had that kind of protection. And so he was not going to mess around. 470 Roman soldiers with this group. And they go at the third hour of the night. So what time is that? 9 o'clock at night. People didn't travel that time of night, but when you got 470 Roman soldiers, you can go about anywhere you wanted in that day and time. You could go just about anywhere you want. You don't have to worry about the road to Jericho if there's any robbers in the ditch or anything like that. You're good. You got 470 Roman soldiers. There's not many places that you wouldn't be safe. And so they go in the middle of the night, and they leave, and they go as far as Caesarea. They also provided mounts for Paul to ride and bring him safely to Felix the governor. So they go to the most protected place within reason, to Caesarea. Caesarea was a very large Roman outpost. It's named after Caesar. It was a very, very well-protected area. It was an area that many of the dignitaries would often go to. If Caesar were going to come to that portion of the world, that's probably where he would have gone. It was a very, very big stronghold for the Roman military. Caesarea, that's where Cornelius lived. And so he takes him there. And so that he could be under the custody of the governor. Verse 26, Claudius Lysias, to his excellency the governor Felix, greetings. This man was seized by the Jews and was about to be killed by them when I came upon them with the soldiers and rescued him. Having learned that he was a Roman citizen, desiring to know the charge for which he was accusing him, I brought him down to their council. I found that he was being accused about questions of their law, but charged him with nothing deserving death or imprisonment. And when it was disclosed to me that there would be a plot against the man, I sent him to you at once, ordering his accusers also to state before you that they have against him. So the soldiers, according to their instructions, took Paul and brought him by night to Antipatris. And on the next day they returned to the barracks, letting the horsemen go on with him. When they had come to Caesarea and delivered the letter to the governor, they presented Paul also before him. On reading the letter, he asked what province he was from, learned that he was from Cilicia. He said, I will give you a hearing when your accusers arrive, and he commanded him to be guarded in Herod's praetorium. And so they take him and get him there. This was all entirely for one thing, God's providence, but this was also entirely because Paul was a Roman citizen. Had he been a Jew, just a regular Jew, and not a Roman citizen, he'd have said, take him. But because of his Roman citizenship, all this happened. They did not want a Roman citizen overtaken and killed by a group of Jews. And so, because they had done that, they had threatened a Roman citizen under Roman custody. They picked on Rome in doing that. And so, that's why the 470 soldiers came out and why they protected Paul. All part of God's plan.